Good day and welcome to this webinar hosted by Verra. My name is Leo Long. I'm going to be MC and hosting this session. We're going to give participants a few more minutes to join. It is top of the hour on my clock, but let's give colleagues a few more minutes to join. We will begin momentarily. Yeah. It is 2 minutes past by my clock. We'll give colleagues 1 more minute and then we'll begin. Okay, we are now 3 minutes past the hour, and I think we have quite a good number of participants. We're up to 40 participants, which is great, and I thank you all for your attendance. Welcome to this webinar specifically for VDBs, hosted by Verra, which is focusing on assessing sustainable development, or SD, contributions under the VCS program. So before we get into the core content of the webinar, I'd like to just run through a couple of house rules. So the session is being recorded. The intention of recording it is that we can share the recording with all registrants. So even if some other VVB representatives were unable to attend the session in person, they will then be able to watch the recording at their leisure and get the same content, the same information. Also, we'll be sharing it for your own reference at a later point. We do allow you and encourage you, if you'd like to turn your camera on, you're welcome to as well. Kindly note that all microphones are put on mute. However, we do encourage your participation. We would like you to please post all questions to the Q&A function. We've also enabled the upvote function there, whereby you can upvote questions that you deem to be pertinent and you'd like to get answered first, or perhaps given more attention. And those questions we will then address at the end of the presentation. We'll have a Q&A session where we will engage with those questions that have been raised. So before we get into the core content as well, I'd like you to introduce you to your presenter, who is going to be Palak. Palak is a program officer in the Sustainable Development Unit, and she's going to be taking us through the content of this webinar. So Palak, with that being said, I'm going to hand over to you to dive into the content. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo, and hi, everyone. We're now going to talk about the objectives and the agenda for this webinar. So firstly, our objective is to ensure that the VVBs, that is you all, understand the requirements for assessing the sustainable development contributions, which come under section 3.17 of the VCS standard version 4.5. If I take you through the agenda for today, it will be divided into 3 sections. The first one being the introduction, where we'll talk about what are the SD contributions. It will focus on introducing the VCS deadlines we have associated with SD contributions, that are the sustainable development contributions. Also, just as an FYI, SD contributions are a short form for sustainable development contributions. So I might use them replacing each other during the course of the webinar. So I hope you would understand. And then the second section, we are going to talk about the expectations and the examples related to SD contributions, which are going to be super basic. We are then in the last section going to talk about assessing the SD contributions themselves. We will be looking at the VCS project description, the monitoring report templates, and we will look at the specific sections which are to be filled by the project proponent for claiming sustainable development contributions. And this would include figuring out the appropriateness of the SDGs, the respective targets, and the respective indicators to be used. Then we will talk about net impacts, and then eventually and ultimately the evidence for the project's SD contributions. Next, let's just begin with our introduction. So as I said, this would be talking about what are SD contributions themselves. What does it mean when a project says that they are contemplating sustainable development contributions? What are the deadlines that we have associated with these? So let's talk more about what are SD contributions. An SD contribution is basically a statement about a project's contribution to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. These are to be supported by quantifiable evidences. The requirement for SD contributions was added in version 4.2 of the VCS standard, which required the project proponents to demonstrate contributions to a minimum of 3 SDGs in all monitoring reports verified after the effective date. So in a nutshell, when we talk about SD contribution, we are talking about the project activities, them leading to some kind of contributions, which are to be measured with the help of SD indicators from the UN database. And these have to be supported by evidence to prove the SD contributions happened because of the project activity. So if you look at this flowchart here, this is just a glimpse of what an SD contribution looks like and where it stems from. If you remember, I just mentioned that these SDGs have to be submitted in the monitoring reports verified after the effective date. So let's talk about the effective dates in the next slide. Now, if you look at this, you can see there are 2 timelines. If you've been working with the VCS standard, you're aware that in July 2022, we released the standalone Sustainable Development Contributions Report template, through which the projects that wanted to or intended to submit a sustainable development contribution can do so with the use of that standalone template. But in January 2022, we updated the VCS monitoring report, which was version 4.3, and that now includes the SD contribution table. This was in line with the requirement in the VCS version 4.2 standard that we just talked about. And in this particular way, we moved to the idea of having an integrated sustainable development contribution within the monitoring report of the VCS standard. Next slide, please. So now, if we talk about the effective dates and dates that the VVBs should pay special attention to that the projects are adhering, are 20th of January 2023. So this has passed. Any project that have requested registration on this date or after this date are required to report their SD contributions at their first verification. So whenever a project which has been registered from 20th January 2023 is submitting its first monitoring report, first verification report, it needs to make sure that it has submitted SD contribution. So this is something that the VVBs must assess that the projects have submitted. The second effective date is 20th of January 2025, which means that any project after this date will be required to submit an SD contribution at their next verification. So this means that after 20th of January 2025, if the project had come in before 2023 January or after it, it doesn't matter. They have to submit their SD contributions within their VCS monitoring report from the next verification. So this was about the effective dates. Let's now move to the next section, which is going to talk about the SD contributions, the examples that we have, the expectations that Verra has in general, and what our reviewers are reviewing when they're looking at SD contributions. So these are some pretexts for assessing the SD contributions. To begin with, I think a really important pillar of the SD contribution, or foundation, let's say, is the SDGs, the United Nations Global Goals for Sustainable Development. They consist of three parts. Let's begin with the goals. So there are 17 goals that the UN has given. These are the 17 SDGs. Within every SDG, or each SDG, there is a target, or there are multiple targets. Within each goal, these targets are trying to specify the different benchmarks that are present for achieving these goals. And then eventually we have the indicators. Now, indicators were developed under each target so that there can be a measure of progress towards achieving these targets or these goals. SD contributions are based on these, and the VCS SD contributions also follow a similar pattern while reporting. A project first would need to share the goal, then the target, and then the indicator to which it is going to contribute. The VBBs need to assess whether this is related to the project activity. Now, sometimes we might find that an indicator from the United Nations SDG database would not be a close fit for a small project level activity, because these indicators are made or designed keeping in mind a national level of effort towards sustainable development. So in those cases, the projects would be able to create a self-defined indicator or a project-specific indicator related to the sustainable development goal and the target. Let's look at an example in the next slide on what are the basic expectations. So let's say a project's activity is building a wind farm. So the outcome is that it is going to supply renewable energy to the grid. Now, in this case, the project can use SDG indicator 7.2.1, which is share of renewable energy. If you look at the next example, it talks about setting up a mobile health clinic. Now, this could be not the primary, but let's say a secondary project activity. In this case, let's say the project is saying that it's going to vaccinate people in the project area. In this case, we will see that the project can now contribute to SD indicator 3.8, which is about universal health coverage. Now, if you remember, I talked about self-defined indicators. If you look at the last one, you would find that universal health coverage is a national level indicator. It is not something that the project level activity can change. So in this case, we would like to see if a project can generate a self-defined indicator. Next slide, please. In a self-defined indicator, we will find that the project can actually create an indicator which is not from the United Nations database. So in the previous example, we saw that the project used one of the indicators from the UN database, but it might not find a proper fit, as we discussed. So the UN metadata, which is a repository of every indicator that is aligned with SDGs, it contains computational methodologies, it has a database on each SDG indicator, each target, but as we know already, they are not always appropriate for a project. So if a VVB needs to assess if an SD indicator used by the project is appropriate, they can check the UN metadata and specifically check the indicator computation and methodology to see if the indicator is a proper fit for the project or not. But in case it is not, the project can always create a self-defined indicator. So we will see that the projects may use a self-defined indicator when an appropriate SDG indicator for that activity is not available in the UN metadata. For example, a project which is providing, let's say, vocational training may use SDG target 4.3, but there is no specific indicator within target 4.3 that talks about providing vocational training. So if the project has to use an indicator that is related to its activity, this example project could use a self-defined indicator under SDG target 4.3. And that could be number of individuals who received training to enable their employment in project activity or elsewhere. So this self-defined indicator, it should not contain any indicator number as a prefix, because this is not from the official list. It is something that has been created by the project. So the VBBs should make sure that there is no official SDG indicator number associated with this self-defined indicator, and they should ensure that this is appropriate. We will talk more about appropriate self-defined indicators, but in a nutshell, we just want to make sure that the most important prerequisite of creating a good self-defined indicator or assessing a good self-defined indicator is making sure that it is a proper match, it is appropriate for the project's activity. Now, let's move to the third section of the presentation where we talk about assessing the SD contributions. In this section, we will look at some important chronological consideration. We will talk about backfiling for sustainable development contributions, and then we will walk through the templates that we have and how VVBs should assess their information. Next slide, please. So the principles for both VVBs and Verra when it comes to reviewing or assessing in VVB's case, the sustainable development contributions are these 4 documents. The first one being the VCS standard version 4.5, the templates for VCS project description, the template for VCS monitoring report, and ultimately the UN metadata on SDGs. We will be sharing the link to the UN metadata on SDGs in the email that we send after the webinar. But in case you want to look at it right now, you can just Google UN metadata for SDGs and you will be able to find it in the official United Nations website. Now, Verra review relies on these principles, and our expectation from the VVBs is also to base their assessment on these same pillars. Moving ahead, we will first talk about some chronological considerations. Now, when a VVB is assessing an SD contribution, they should keep in mind that there are chronological considerations, which are the contributions must be claimed in discrete periods based on when they were achieved. This means that let's say a monitoring report for a period of 1st January 2021 to 31st December 2021 must contain SD claims of that discrete period only. It is a distinct period. Second, the reporting is current and cumulative over a project lifetime. This means that the reporting of SD contributions has to provide the current contribution in this discrete period. Plus, apart from it, it has to provide the cumulative contribution, which means that any contribution that has happened till now. We will look at the examples, so please don't worry if it feels or looks overwhelming right now, or if it doesn't make sense. We'll be looking at examples for each one of them. And thirdly, SD contribution tables can be used to account for multiple VCS monitoring periods. If you read this and then you read the first point, I know this sounds opposite to the first one, but there is a way to account for multiple VCS monitoring periods in a single monitoring report table with the use of backfiling. So let's check out what backfiling is and when does a project do it, and how can a VVB assess if the backfiling has been done properly. So what is backfiling? When a project who has not used the standalone report to account for any SD contributions during the previous monitoring period starts using the VCS monitoring report template to provide their SD contributions, there may be some contributions that fall outside of this monitoring report. So maybe they start doing it from this monitoring period, but then they were also doing the same activities in the previous monitoring period, and they haven't put this into any of the MR or standalone reports. So who can do it? Projects who have verified in the past without submitting a standalone SD contribution report, but they now want to make an SD contribution for those previous monitoring periods. Now, this is not a requirement. It is an optional system that exists for projects that may want to do this. Now, the VVB can make sure that this backfiling is done properly, but how can you assess it? So firstly, the project should have completed the respective section of the VCS MR at their current verification, which talks about SD contributions. And we will talk about what that section should include. But for now, the most important thing is to make sure that in this monitoring period, they have filled the section which is related to SD contributions. Then the second and more important thing is that they should include all contributions, which also include contributions from their previous monitoring periods in the current and lifetime columns. So what they can do is they can add a footnote below the SD table in this section, and that footnote can say, this table includes sustainable development contributions from so-and-so date to so-and-so date. Now, this specifies to us or any stakeholders that the SD table is representing contributions that have been made in the previous monitoring periods, apart from the current one. Now, one important thing that we usually recommend, or when we review the project, which we usually note, is that the projects should not or should try to steer away from SD contributions report, but projects that do not have a verification plan but want to make an SD claim on previous monitoring report. They can also use the same standalone report, but then this is something that can be done if they don't want to create an SD contributions report separately. And if they want to use the back filing system, this is something that they can do within this monitoring report that they are submitting. And the VVBs can make sure and assess that there is proper evidence to not just the contributions from this monitoring period, but also from the previous one. So everything that applies to the current monitoring period contributions will also apply to the ones that they are backfiling now. So every rule that we'll now talk about will apply to the previous monitoring reports contributions also. Next slide, let's now talk about the templates finally, something that we've been waiting for. So now we will review the requirements from the VCS templates. We'll first start from the VCS project description template. Section 1.18 is here to understand, basically to make everybody understand, whoever is reading the project description, that what the expected sustainable development contributions would look like. Now, this section follows a pretty simple logic. Project activities will lead to sustainable development contributions. The VVBs need to assess that the project has provided information on that as per the template requirements. The template is very clear on what it needs, just no more than 500 words of description on what SD contributions will the project be making in its coming monitoring period. Next is the VCS monitoring report. Now, this is where the actual work starts for the project and for the VVBs. So at the verification assessment, the VVBs should refer to section 1.12 of the VCS monitoring report, version 4.3. And this table is the heart and soul of the section. And the VVBs are expected to assess these in line with the principles that we've talked about, the standard, the UN metadata, and the template requirements. What we will do now is we will move column by column in this table. I will be zooming each of these sections, so you don't have to wait on this one or open the template side by side. But you're free to open the template if you want to. It's on the Verra website under the VCS templates. What we will now do is see what these sections should consist of, and then we will see what the VVBs should assess when they are looking at these sections or these specific columns. Next slide, please. In this case, the most important and the first thing that we begin with is how to assess the SDGs targets and the indicators chosen by the project. I have spoken to you about the UN metadata. I will speak again because that is definitely the foundation of the SD contributions. UN metadata is a repository of all the SDG targets and indicators. It is the best resource to assess whether the indicators are aligning with the project contributions, project activities or not. Again, if you find that the existing indicators do not align with the project activities, you know that the project can use a self-defined indicator. And in those cases, they would not be providing a number to the SDG indicator under the column, the second column. As we discussed in the previous section, the VVBs should be able to assess the appropriateness of not just the UN indicator, but also the self-defined indicator based on the template instructions and the appropriateness of the new indicator. So it follows a very simple logical chain that the project activity should be related to the indicator that it is choosing. If there is no indicator from the UN metadata, the next best option is to create your own indicator, which aligns closely with the project activity. Next slide. The next section that we have is a net impact on SDG indicator. So once the project has listed the SDG target, the SDG indicator, the project needs to then speak about the contribution that it is making. So what direction is the contribution in? Is it going to increase it? Is it going to decrease it? So let's say, talk about this example. We have a project that is talking about distributing improved cook stoves. The first contribution it does is use of cleaner fuels. And the SDG target or indicator that it is using is 7.1.2, which is proportion of population with primary reliance on clean fuels and technology. In this case, the proportion of population or the number of people who are using clean fuels is going to increase. So the project can use implemented activities to increase. In the second case, the project says that a second contribution is that there is reduced time spent on collecting fuel. In this case, the indicator is self-defined, and they say time spent on unpaid domestic and care work by sex, age, and location. In this case, the net impact is implemented activities to decrease because the time is being reduced. One really important point that the VBBs can do here is just look at the direction of the indicator and compare it to the direction of the net impact that the project has provided, and just ensure that whether this net impact is in line with the indicator's direction or not. That's as simple as that. Next slide, please. In the next section, so once there is indicator, there's a target, there's an indicator, there's a net impact direction, we then talk about the contribution itself. So there are two columns which talk about contributions, and we discussed them in brief before. One is contributions over project lifetime, and the second is current project contribution. So the current project contributions are a measure of the present contributions, whereas the project lifetime contributions are a cumulative measure of every period before the current one. If this is the first time the project is filing for an SD contribution, both of the sections will contain exactly the same number, exactly the same contribution. But if it is, let's say, the third contribution, then the current project contribution would just be, let's say, the third one. But the contributions of a project lifetime would be 1 plus second plus third. That is the cumulative sum of it. The VBBs should be able to assess that the contributions claimed are in line with these criteria, and they do not include any predicted contributions in the lifetime column. So you might know that the project is planning to do something. It's planning to employ 20 people over its lifetime, but then that's a prediction. It's a plan. It hasn't happened. Over project lifetime contributions should only contain everything that has happened already in the past monitoring periods. We will talk about a few examples here to see how it goes. So in the next slide, I will take you through one example where if this is not a table from the SD contribution section, it is a custom table that I have created for you to see a project's contribution over 3 monitoring periods. For example, if you look in the first row, you will see that in monitoring period 1, project A contributes to SDG indicator 7. The indicator is self-defined. The indicator is amount of total renewable energy supplied from the project activity. So this is the first monitoring period. And you will see that the current contribution and the lifetime contributions are exactly the same number of units. Now, exactly as I said, projects using the SD table for the first time should report lifetime contributions while also claiming them as the current ones. And the VBBs should assess that. As seen in this example, there are no predicted claims or contributions included in the contributions over project lifetime column for the first MP. And please note it again that any project should never include predicted contributions in this column, even if it is planning to supply X megawatt hertz of energy in the future. It is not recommended to include it beforehand. An important recommendation is to also assess that there are only quantified values provided in the contributions column. However, if the project ended up using some language, the VBB should make sure that they are using the language used in the lifetime contribution and the current contribution. So it should be the same one. It should be consistent across both these columns. Let's talk about another example, which is in the next slide. In this case, there are no contributions to an indicator in the second monitoring period. So it's fine if there is a constant contribution, you will keep on adding it to the contributions over project lifetime, and you increase your cumulative one over time. But what happens if the project has not created anything in one of its monitoring period? So in this one, it was talking about people who received informal training to enable their employment. And in the second monitoring period, there was no one who received this informal training. So the project wrote and it can write no further changes this reporting period, and that is completely acceptable to us. And the VBBs should also make sure that there is a proper language to signify that there is no contribution. And in this case, the only thing is that the cumulative will remain the same from the previous monitoring period. It is not going to change. And in the next one, you go back to the usual, where you have any contribution, you add it to the previous cumulative one, and so on and so forth. The VVBs just have to assess, and in this case, that the contributions are in line with the previous monitoring reports and they are consistently written in the same format, in the same quantifiable language, and that's it. And then we move to the next slide where we talk about the evidence of SD contributions. Now, lastly, it is very, very essential to have proof of contributions to these SDGs by the project. This is not just a VVB level requirement where you all would be checking for information against some evidence, but this is also a VCS template instruction. This means that the project proponent should be providing us evidence of these SD contributions as appendices to the monitoring report. Now, the project may include the following pieces of evidence to support their SD contribution claims, like official receipts. If they are buying something and distributing it, one of the best ways to show an evidence is show a receipt of buying that good before you distribute it. If it's also about distribution, then there could be photos, but these photos should have identification markers. Then if the project has employed people, it could show payrolls, salary slips for hiring. It could also talk about media coverage, so it can share any kind of magazines or newspaper clips that it has received for its work, its SD contributions. And the VVB should assess if the evidence directs Verra reviewers towards the involvement of the project proponent in the contributions of these sustainable development indicators and targets of the project. So that's it for the template. And now moving forward, we will talk about some examples. So I talked about how we should assess for the appropriateness of the SD indicator, how we should talk about a project creating a self-defined indicator when it cannot find a proper fit. But what is an appropriate one? There is no definition of an appropriate indicator. It is just something which is a logical fit to the project's activity. But we do have a lot of examples of incorrect claims. And we will discuss some of these examples of incorrect contributions that we often come across. I will be discussing 3 major categories, and we will discuss an example for each one of these. But most incorrect claims or contributions run across multiple categories. So just a disclaimer that this will not cover everything, and we are not trying to segregate these issues by any types. It could be any type of inappropriateness, but the most ones that we encounter are here. The first one is when SD contributions have insufficient action, which means that the activity or the impact does not demonstrate that it contributes to that particular SDG indicator that the project has chosen. Let's look at this example. The claim is that the project is providing tuition fee, that is the fee for an education of around 40 children. Now, the SDG indicator they have used is 4.1.1, which is proportion of children and young people in grades 2 to 3 at the end of primary and at the end of lower secondary, achieving at least a minimum proficiency level in reading and mathematics by sex. Now, the issue with this is, it looks like, this is a correct indicator that they've used, and it looks like a fit. But the issue is the project is only providing tuition fee, but not measuring the proficiency levels. If you look at the entire indicator, it talks about the people who are getting this education, but they should have at least achieved a proficiency level. And the project is not doing anything to completely contribute to this indicator and each part of this indicator, because they're not checking the proficiency level of the children as indicated by 4.1.1. So the solution in those cases could be that the project can use a better suited indicator. It could use a self-defined indicator like number of children in education. And in this case, the VVB's role is to make sure that the project uses the most suitable indicator that it can find from within the SD indicator database, or if not, then the self-defined indicator created is most closely aligned with the project activity. Let's look at the second example. The second category is when the SD contributions have no baseline. Now, this is something that we encounter very often because most of the SD contributions, SD indicators from the official UN database have been made or have been constructed keeping in mind this idea of proportion. So the indicators require a measured change, but it is impossible to tell if any change has occurred in the project's contribution without a baseline data. Let's look at one of these examples. Let's say the project claims that the project has had 0 workplace death. It is a great contribution, and the SDG indicator they've used is 8.8.1, which is fatal and non-fatal occupational injuries for 100,000 workers by sex and migrant status. Now, the issue with this one is that despite the project providing a very safe work environment to its employees, they cannot prove a contribution to 8.8.1 without giving a baseline of occupational injuries in their work environment, in the sector maybe. So it's not possible for us to just assume that the project has had 0 workplace deaths per 100,000 workers, because we don't know if this was assessed against 100,000 workers as per the United Nations database. Solution is, again, maybe if the project has access, they can provide baseline data, and the VVB can assess if this baseline data justifies the use of SDG indicator 8.8.1. Or in the other case, where there is no baseline data, the project can use a better suited indicator from the UN database itself, if it finds any. If not, it can create a self-defined indicator. Now, just to be clear, not all indicators require baseline. It's not that every contribution that the project makes has to be against a baseline. It's just that if the indicator language itself suggests the uses of a baseline, like per 100,000 workers, then this is something that should be assessed against a baseline. Or if not, then the project is free to use, as I said, a better suited indicator or a self-defined indicator. The next one and the last category that we have for SD contributions claims, or which are not correct, is insufficient evidence. Now, in these cases, the impact does not demonstrate that the target or indicator has been met or the contribution has actually occurred. The activity is likely to help contribute to the SDG in some measure, but the measurement is insufficient. I know it's confusing, but let's talk about the claim here. The claim is the project employed 25 local workers, and SDG indicator used was 8.5.2, which is unemployment rate by sex, age, and person with disabilities. The issue is the project employs people, but it does not have enough evidence to support the change in the unemployment rate, because unemployment rate is a national phenomena. It is affected by multiple variables other than the number of people employed. So in those cases, the solution is use a better suited indicator if you find any from the UN database, or a self-defined indicator, like a very simple one just says number of jobs created. Now, this is a very brief example, but you might encounter projects that have used SDG indicators which do not align with their contributions, and then the best option then is to assess them at the level of appropriateness in line with the project's activity. That's it for the examples, and I would just like to give a summary of the assessment of SD contributions in the last slide. So just to reiterate, what logic do we use as Verra when reviewing a project's SD claims? The first important thing for us is the correct choice of SD indicator. What makes an indicator unfit for us? We discussed it before. The VVBs must also assess that the SDGs are coming from the UN database, which is the UN metadata, as I've discussed before. If it doesn't look like an exact fit, the VVBs can assess the self-defined indicator that the project has used and check it for the appropriateness level. The second most important thing is to use to check the appropriateness or fit of the self-defined indicator. And if the VVB finds that it is not a complete fit, if it's not aligning properly, then it should make sure that the project proponent is made aware of it. Thirdly, the third thing is to stick to the contribution rules that we discussed. The VVB should make sure that they are assessing that the projects are adhering to the rules on the contributions and lifetime that we have mentioned in the slides previously. And this is all in line with the backfiling rules, the chronological rules, and the other rules that we have discussed about contributions and the template requirements. And the last thing is that the VVBs should be able to assess that the project proponent has provided acceptable evidence that shows its complete and direct involvement in the activities that lead to these SD contributions. We expect to we assess the SD contributions based on these 4 major criteria, and we expect the VVBs to do the assessment of the SD contributions using the same lens that we use. That is it, and I would now pass it over to Leo. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Palak. That was very informative. Thank you. We at the end of the presentation, and would like to now take the questions that have been posed. Palak, we have 3 questions in the Q&A function. Can we take them from the top?
Yes.
The first one, yeah, please, if I can read the first one, perhaps. It says, relative to the effective date identified, am I correct to interpret that if a project was registered before the 20th of January 2023, but reports after the 20th of January 2023, it does not need to respond to the SDG table in monitoring report 4.3?
No, I will again explain the rules. So if a project came in before 20th of January 2023, then it would eventually need to submit the SD contributions if by 20th January 2025. So after 20th January 2025, every project, irrespective of it being registered in 2022, 23 January, or 2002 also, will submit an SD contributions report. So if the project was registered before 20th of January 2023, it will not need to submit an SDG contributions in the monitoring report till 20th of January 2025. It is not a requirement for them to do it till then, but then after that date, everybody has to do it. Every project has to do it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. The next one says, for contributions over project lifetime, am I correct to interpret that a long-running project that did not previously report SDG contributions in previous monitoring periods do not need to identify SDG contributions for those previous periods in the lifetime column? So it's not a requirement per se.
Yes, you're correct. The interpretation is right. You do not need to provide contributions from any MRs that you have not already submitted to us. I mean, no, let me rephrase it for you. So yes, the interpretation is correct that any project that did not submit any SDG contributions in previous MRs do not need to provide SD contributions for those previous periods in this lifetime column. They can do it. It's a choice. They can use the back filing system and provide us a detail of breakdown of this contribution happened in this period and this period and this period. It is optional. As I said, the presentation had one slide where we talked about the monitoring period 1 + 2 + 3. A project needs to do it. If they want to do it, they can do it, but it's not something that is a requirement. You don't need to go back to the previous MRs and pull out all the SDG contributions and put it in the current ones.
Absolutely. The next one, Palak, it says, am I correct that the SDG indicators are at the x.x.x level of the UN metadata and not the x.x level? So it'll be the numbering 7.1.2, so forth.
Yeah, thanks, Leo, for the interpretation. Yeah, so yes, you're correct to interpret that, because x.x level is basically the target level, which is also a part of the SD contributions table. But then it doesn't talk about the specific fit because it's a very overarching target. You definitely need to assess if that is also a fit, because sometimes you can have a wrong target and this might not, the project's contribution might not fall under that target. But then still the SDG indicators, as you said, are specifically at the x.x.x level of the UN metadata. And there is a PDF file associated with all of the SDG indicators in the UN metadata. I would recommend that when your project is using that particular indicator, you can look at that metadata file and just see for yourself what is basically the requirement of that SDG indicator, the computational requirements, the methodology to assess it, where should the data come from, and there are a lot of database suggestions in that metadata. So if that's helpful, then yes, please look at the documents also.
Thank you, Palak. The last one in the Q&A function, it says, how do you document evidence for a decrease, like in the example, reduced time for collecting firewood?
That's a really interesting question. First, I think we would like to see if there's an indicator that talks about it, because as I said, that most of the indicators have a list of computational which somehow indicate that there is an indicator that can be used or evidence that can be used to contribute to it. And they do have examples for it, but I don't think that I can think of any SD indicator at this point, which is related to this contribution. If I were to think a report like this, I would probably recommend that we use something like respondent surveys, where the stakeholders who are collecting firewood might report that they're spending less time on fuel wood collection. So this could be a way. That's only something that I can think of right now, but I can definitely go back and research a bit on this and get back on this question.
Thank you. Absolutely, Palak. So, Martin, we're going to shortly share Palak's email. And I think if you have a specific question as this one, you're welcome to email Palak and she can engage you on what would be appropriate. I see there is a question in the chat function, Palak, that perhaps we need to address as well. It says, how could the dates be clarified once more? So I'm not sure if you want to just address those effective dates one last time, please, Palak.
Yes, of course. Can we go to that slide, Leo, if it's possible?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Sure, if you give me a second, we can backtrack.
Sure, thank you.
I'm going to start here, standalone.
No, the next one.
Okay.
This one. So yes, I can go over the dates again. Any project that is registered after 20th of January 2023, whenever they come to submit their first verification, they will need to provide the details of their SD contributions in the VCS monitoring report. That is established. Now, if a project was registered before 20th of January 2023, they don't need to do it in their next verification, but after 20th of January 2025, they would need to do it. So after 20th of January 2025, it's a blanket requirement. Any project that is coming to us will need to report their SD contributions in their next verification, whichever verification is after 20th of January 2025. Whether your project, as I said, was registered in 2022, 2002, or 2010, or 2024, it doesn't matter. You will have to give a SD contribution in your next verification. I hope it's clear. If not, then I can probably write an explanation in the email that Leo sends out.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Palak. I'm going to skip us back to the last slide that we were on. I see there's one more question that says, could the context of the standalone SD contribution report?
Yeah, so standalone SD contribution report was a voluntary system. We introduced those in July 2022, and this was something that the projects could do if they wanted to fulfill, let's say, course year requirements. But now, at this point in January 2022, we already updated the VCS standard to include the specific rule where every project needs to submit a VCS SD contribution under VCS. And that became a part of the VCS monitoring report itself. So there is no use of any standalone report at this point. If a project wants to make an SD contribution, it can do so using the VCS monitoring report template version 4.3.
Absolutely. Palak, I see we are heading towards the time, but there's one more question in the Q&A function. If you'd field this last one, it says, if a project requested a listing prior to January 2023, but the first validation and verification is submitted after January 2023, is the project required to report SD contributions in the first verification report?
Yeah, this is a requirement for registration and not listing. So if the project was registered before January 2023, then it's not a requirement. But then if the project is coming for a validation, as you say, that is registration, after January 2023, then that verification will need to have an SD contribution in the report.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think at this point, Palak, I'd like to just share with the audience your contact details. So if there are any other questions related to SD contributions under the VCS, can I encourage the VVB representatives present, if you can send your emails to Palak's email, and should be more than willing to respond to you. I'd like to thank Palak for an excellent presentation and very informative. I also thank the attendees for their time in attending this webinar hosted by Verra, and we look forward to hosting you again in the near future. We wish you a blessed festive season and a prosperous new year. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Happy New Year, everyone. Bye.